and welcome to our explanation of your teaching method 2 assignment. So what we're doing is we're making an assignment that is very, very similar to the GTPA that you need to complete in your final school experience. So what we've put up for you is this, which is a template, and I'm going to then show you another document which we have put up for you, which includes some examples of evidence that you can potentially collect for each of those sections that we have in your template. So what you've needed to do over your prac is to go through and plan and teach and assess a particular sequence of lessons and have 3 focus children within those lessons. So what we need you to do is your plan, teach, assess and reflect cycle, including a context and a reference list. So let's look at each of the elements in a bit more detail. Now, on our template, we've got this initial data table. Can you please expand it out? For some reason, it's not showing. I'll put up one that will have it expanded, but just in case it does its weird thing again, make sure you expand it out because the other questions are sitting underneath. Now, with your table of contents, obviously you're going to be adding in lots of additional details and those page numbers will no longer be accurate. This is a imported table of contents that I have added, so it will update automatically, but you do need to prompt it to do that. So tap once on it, drop the little one down and go update table, and then as long as you haven't deleted any of the elements out, it will all update, because you will end up with quite a large assignment. Not a huge amount of writing that you need to do, but it will be a large assignment. So what you need to put in is your school context form. So just take some screenshots. You won't be able to put a PDF onto a Word document, but take some screenshots and add those in. So make sure that that goes into the correct part 1. Now, in part 2, as with parts 3, 4 and 5, there are 2 questions to guide you. Now, each of those questions then has some potential sentence starters. We've given you a word guide. Don't think that it's a word limit. So if you end up doing 300 words, that's fine. But don't go and write 1,000 words on it because that's not necessary. Think about how you can capture the essential elements. You don't need to give us a whole lot of waffle. So first question, how and why did you plan your sequence of lessons? And refer to the SCASA documents and school-based planning documents. So think how you can start that. So you can say that when I went and spoke with my mentor, she said that the students were performing above expected standard and she showed me some data from term 1. I could see that the focused children were at this stage, and this stage. The curriculum for year 4 says that they need to achieve this and this. The students were doing well in this, but not so well in this. My school uses prime maths as their textbook, and this is what we will work on during the term. Now, you can write that up and then you've got some potential data elements. So if you have a look, how and why did you plan your lessons? So what you can have is you can include a screenshot of curriculum descriptors. You could include your teacher's planning documents. You could also put in some assessment pointers. So some schools use the judging standards and the assessment pointers as their guidelines of what they want to ensure that they're covering all of that work adequately. Now, in our second question, how does the initial data collected explain each of the focused students' desired level of performance? Because what you're choosing are 3 particular students. You want the whole class, but then you also want to make sure you've got 3 students. 1 student working around the expected level for that year level, 1 student working above and 1 student working below. Now, we know it's not always possible to get exactly that configuration, but you're likely to have somebody who's doing okay, somebody doing well, and somebody not doing so well. So what you want to be able to do is then say, how did those students do and how did I plan for them? So, what does the initial data you collected explain how does it explain each of their desired level of performance and readiness for learning? So, let's have a look at some data that you could collect. So, you could have some anecdotal notes, and that could relate to a particular child, or it could relate to a group of children. You could have a work sample from a particular student. You could then also have a whole class set of data. This was their cold task, a writing cold task. So each of the students are listed, and then your 3 focus students are highlighted. And you can see that there's a small annotation to it. So that is some of the sample data. Samples of work from each focus student, samples of whole class data. You don't need to include them as giant pages. You could just do little snapshots. What you're doing is just including enough data to be able to say, after completing some initial work during weeks 1 and 2, I was able to analyze out the data and it showed me that ... These students were having difficulty. This group of students were doing really well, and this group of students, I needed to think about how I would plan to cater for them being significantly above the other students. So what you want to be able to do is show how you use data to inform your planning. So then we move on to the teaching part. So the planning part is the thinking that went into how you constructed your forward planning document. The teaching part is about what you actually did when you taught it. So what teaching strategies did you use to ensure you connected with and built on their prior learning? So at the start of my placement, I realised that most of the students needed to use lots of hands-on materials in mathematics, and that if I tried to move them on to the representational or into the abstract too early, that they didn't achieve very well. So when I planned my lessons, I made sure that I planned these things. The strategies that I found most effective in my teaching were, and explain it in some way. So think about in your teaching, what was some of the work that the students produced? So you might have in here some of the work, and then you're putting in the ways that you did it. So you scaffolded out to assist their writing. You've then got an assessment task that you can elaborate on. Or you could include some links to the curriculum, some planning documents, and how you then changed it and adapted it for the learning sequence that would work best with those children. Then we move on to, so we've looked at what were the strategies that you used that built on their prior knowledge. Then we talk about what teaching decisions. You may find that you have overlaps between these. That's okay. Try and just write a small amount about each. So what pedagogical decisions did you make to ensure you differentiated? So on our last reflective practice day, we talked a lot about how you differentiate to meet the needs of every student. So this is where you can say, during my first few weeks, I noticed that student A, B or C needed, or they responded best to. I made sure I adjusted my lessons, and this is how I did it. My most effective strategies were, and explain it. So what you could have for those is you may use your forward planning documents, and you might go in and put in some red text in some way. You can also go in and say, this is what I need to do next because they couldn't do it. And there's a little note, students did not complete the independent writing task this lesson. So it's just clearly saying, we didn't get to that. There's nothing wrong with saying that. It's just saying these are the decisions that I made. And then this is what I had to do to clarify that. This is one that is annotated. So we've got the activity that they became restless and so on. They loved that particular one, but here, nope, they were not able to do that. So you're annotating over the top of your planning documents in some way. So then we move on to our assessment. So, what assessment tools did you choose, and explained how they showed individual growth and achievement? So, I use the following assessment tools. Now, remember that assessment tools could be the thing you got the students to do, but it's actually more related to how did you show whether they could do it or not. So, you got them to do a hot writing task. However, your analysis of that hot writing task is actually the assessment that you want to comment on. And that's where you say, I found the students were able to, or the students had difficulty with, or they struggled with this, and so on. The data showed me that these particular students could or couldn't do. Things to consider to include in your assessment. So in here, you've got some data that can be whole class data. So you might look at this over more than one lesson. So you could have anecdotal notes on each of your focus students over different periods of time. You could have annotated work samples that explain how they were able to or what they were missing. You could have whole class data that is showing particular skills or concepts that you were looking at. You could have a rubric related to a piece of work. So you're showing and then explaining how the students are showing their achievement. Now, next part, and these again, you'll have overlaps between them.
I'm not sure I understand.
How did you make consistent quality judgments, referring to the SCASA achievement standards and curriculum documents? So this is where you will go in and you will say, this was our checklist that we were looking at. This is taken directly from the SCASA judging statements. This is our rubric that we used. This was relating to the judging standards that our teacher used. This is how the student achieved according to that. So you're making sure that you are explaining how you're linking everything back. You're not just making up stuff. And then your final part that you need to include is how did you use data in your reflection? How did you use data to monitor their progress and modify their teaching and assessment strategies? So you talk about how did you actually use the data? So my initial data collection was from the data I found throughout the unit of work. So what you're doing is you're looking back at what you've done over the entire period of your forward planning document. So this is where you want to get that thinking happening prior to you leaving the school. So that one, how did you use the data? And identify and justify future teaching and assessment practices in relation to relevant theory. So if I were to continue teaching this class, they would need more work on adjectives and pronouns. If I were to teach this unit of work again, I would make sure that I started with da. And these are the sorts of things that you could include. So you may include a range of work and tell us why that work was important. You may look at your planning documents and you might say, next time I'm going to do this, and so on. So you want to make sure that you are including lots of data. This one in the reflection of the assessment data is saying my cold task compared to my hot task, because a cold task is what they do as your diagnostic. Your hot task is what happens at the end after you've had the lessons in between. You could include the goals that students came up with, and you could have different types of work samples in there to comment on about how they would need more lessons around this particular thing and so on. And we want to put in at least 1 or 2 references to make sure you're linking it back to some theory. And those references could be things like constructivism. They could be anything to do with the particular learning area that you're talking about. So each of those elements has data. Both of those documents are available for you. Our video, as well as this document with examples, is all available on your assessment section in Blackboard. Thanks everyone. I'll talk to you all during our reflective practice day.